All right, Sean.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me out tonight, especially many of you probably are in-service teachers and have been teaching all day like I have. But I appreciate you coming out tonight. And since we have kind of a smaller number as opposed to it being, a big, large conference, 50, 60 people, because it's smaller, I'm happy for this to run kind of more like a discussion as opposed to me just lecturing for an hour. So I'll periodically ask if people have questions. I'm happy for you to chime in. You can certainly use the chat function. Um, but then it puts a big blinking light on my screen. So if you just write you can use chat if you want to, but I'll also ask questions as we go along. A little bit of an introduction to me. Dr. Sean McCarther. I teach at Westminster Choir College of Rider University. I teach applied voice, both to classical singers and to musical theater students in our School of Fine and Performing Arts. And I teach the pedagogy courses. I'm part of the pedagogy team here at undergraduate and graduate pedagogy. Additionally, I teach a class called Movement for the Performer, which is part of our performance curriculum. While getting my doctorate degree at Indiana University, I did a lot of work in the theater department. So I'm very interested in how actors and singers use their bodies physically as physical vessels of expression. And I am also a stage combat director. So here's a fun little thing of me being choked by a friend of mine. So I do most of the fights for our productions here. I've done the sword fights in Hamlet. I've done the knife fights in Oklahoma. And then recently, I've begun to move into how consent and how consent culture can affect the way we present ourselves on stage. And that's allowed me to do some work with intimacy choreography as well. I've done the violence and intimacy for Spring Awakening. And I'm very interested for our students to learn how to protect themselves when they are engaged in very, shall we say, not always the pleasant sides of things, of extreme emotions, and how we deal with that psychologically and emotionally as individuals, but also as professionals. Um, and so I say a lot of this stuff, and my current research interests are in learning theory, motor learning theory, how it is that we learn, how I can be a more effective teacher, how we practice more efficiently. I've been working a lot with my colleague James Jordan on the intersection of choral and vocal pedagogy. So how what I do in the voice studio as an applied teacher and what he does in the choir room as a choir director, how we can synthesize, there's a word, synthesize those two things together. And I say all of that, and every time I give this lecture or a versions of this lecture, I preface with all of that to say that I actually don't like to practice, and I never really have. And I think the main reason for that is I never felt as a student that I knew what I was supposed to do. I would go into the practice room and I would learn pitches and rhythms, and that was kind of about it. And as most of you know, by the way, you can show your hands or a little thumbs up emoji. How many of you teach choirs? Is that mostly people here, choir directors? Okay. I'm going to assume that's the audience, choir directors. Um, I venture to say that most of your students who do practice probably don't really know what they're supposed to do beyond pitches and rhythms. And for those of you who are choir directors, you have some particular problems that go along with being a choir director. Um, Not only are you the music director, but you are the artistic director. You have to be an administrator, especially if you're in a high school or a middle school, because that's just part of the job. Oftentimes all of us that deal with students are counselors, right? Especially right now in the middle of a global pandemic. My university is completely remote, and so half the time I feel like I'm a grief counselor when I'm working with my students, because my seniors, this is their senior year. And I'm sure that many of you have similar instances. Even if you are in person, there's a lot going on, and we have to be there for our students. I put on here cat wrangler because there's a reason I teach in college. I don't teach in the middle school and high school. I deal with select individuals when I choose to. I have a lot of students that want to be middle school choir directors, and God bless them, because that is a unique population that needs some love and some care. But I imagine some days it does feel like you're wrangling cats. But to the specific point of tonight's lecture, oftentimes a choir director is the voice teacher of most of the people in their choirs, especially in middle school and high school. I had voice lessons my senior year of high school, but my primary vocal instruction came from my high school choir director, who was really great, but she had 2 degrees in piano with a choral emphasis. So she wasn't actually a singer. She did really well, and I had a good technical foundation. But I think it's important that we begin, that we think about how, as choir directors, we can impart vocal instruction to our students. And that's kind of my job as an applied voice teacher who has an immense love for choral music. I met my wife in choir. So, there's always, there's that. Um, so you all have it hard, and what I would like to do tonight is present a little bit. So part of the problem with doing vocal technique en masse, which is what you all have to do. I have the benefit of just working with students one-on-one. Unfortunately, you cannot provide a general cue that will solve every individual specific problem, right? No matter how great pedagogical wisdom it is, if you're delivering it to 30 people, at least one of them, probably more, is either going to misunderstand it or just not get it to begin with, if they're even listening. Um, so virtual rehearsals, by the way, complicate this process. I had to do some class voice stuff at a choir camp this summer. And if you don't have everybody mute, it's just cacophony, right? And so you have to do your rehearsals with them muted, which means you can't hear them. And so how do you give feedback to something you can't hear? So what I think that we need to do is we need to begin to figure out how we can set up the general conditions so that singers discover specific techniques for themselves. And this actually aligns with motor learning theory kind of a lot. One of the big things in motor learning is that we need to help students become autonomous or independent. As an applied teacher, I want to remove myself from the equation as much as I can. Learning doesn't actually happen in their voice lessons. I firmly believe that learning happens when they go to the practice room. I have 2 kids. I do not need to follow my students around to their practice room. I've got enough to do with at my own home. So I want to give them the strategies and the techniques and the skills that when they go into the practice room, they can self-assess and they can self-monitor and discover their technique on their own. Warm-ups is about the best time to do this, I think, in a choir. And again, I've been working with my colleague, James Jordan, on this for a while. He's revising his choral warm-up book. I'm contributing 6 chapters to that to figure out how we can use the warm-up as a place to impart vocal technique in choirs that need that, which I think is most middle school, high school, and most church choirs as well. So a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about learning, a little bit about what learning is, a little bit about what learning is not, and then we're going to talk about some of the key elements of efficient learning and practice, because essentially what I think that we need to do, especially in remote environments, is give our students good practice techniques, albeit they're going to be practicing during your choral rehearsal. Even when we're back in person, I think that the strategies still apply. And then we're going to talk about some specific applications to vocal technique. In just a second, at the end of it, I'm going to throw some links into the chat. I've just created a series of YouTube videos that covers 7 different elements of vocal technique and how I would approach them. So I'll throw those out to you and you can look at those at the end. Before I move on, any specific questions about what we've covered so far? Just unmute and go, because I can't see hands. All right. When I was in grad school, they said, anytime you ask for questions, wait 10 seconds. So 10 seconds is a long time to wait. So I'm hoping that everyone got a chance. So a little bit about learning. There's actually 2 different types of learning. There's a learning that's called declarative learning. And declarative learning can be described as know that learning, as in, I know that Abraham Lincoln was president, right? Whenever we assess whether or not someone has learned a declarative piece of information, the way we can do that is they have to declare it. They speak it aloud. And this is really easy to do in a classroom setting because I can ask them to give an oral report, or I can ask them to write an essay, or I can give them a test. It's something that they can give back to me. They can speak it aloud, they declare it. On the other hand, there is procedural learning. And procedural learning can be described as know-how learning, as in I know how to ride a bike. Just because you can declare that you can ride a bike, and just because You can tell me the steps to do it. You can speak aloud that you sit on the thing and you pedal your feet and you go forward. That doesn't necessarily mean you know how to ride a bike. Those are two very different things. And what we do as musicians is pretty much entirely procedural, at least the performing aspect. All the musicology and theory stuff, that's declarative. But the ability to stand up in front of somebody and make a sound is procedural. And I think this is something that oftentimes frustrates beginning students. It definitely was one of the things looking back that probably frustrated me. You may have gathered that I'm a rather technically oriented person. I was going to do chemical engineering actually if I hadn't done music. And that's why I teach voice science. I love the physics of sound. And so when my teacher started talking to you about where the diaphragm was, and that when I breathe in, the diaphragm flattens and that it flares out the rib cage, that made sense to me. And so I knew that the diaphragm was descend, and I knew that my soft palate was supposed to move back and my larynx was supposed to lower and all of those things that we talk about. But I didn't necessarily know how to do them. Or more importantly, to what we're going to talk about in a minute, what it felt like when they happened, Um, no amount of technical knowledge makes up for a lack of experiential knowledge. And so just because we know that something is supposed to happen does not mean that we can actually make it happen. So this brings us to one of the branches of psychology that kind of deals with this idea, this aspect of procedural learning, and that is called motor learning. The definition of motor learning is a set of processes associated with practice or experience leading to relatively permanent changes in skilled behavior. A couple of key elements from this. First, motor learning, or learning any kind of procedural task, is a series of events. It is a process. And it's important for our students in particular to realize that it is a process. I'm a very ambitious person. I want to learn it now. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the way it works, right? There's a certain sequence of events that have to get laid in order for a skilled behavior to happen. And so the thing I'm constantly reminding my students, especially now, we're 2 weeks away from the end of our semester here. My students hit the wall about 4 weeks ago, and now they're just kind of limping to the finish line. Reminding them that this is a process that takes time, I think, is incredibly important. It's one of the big things I work with my students, is getting them to understand that it's a process that will take time and to enjoy that process. This process is associated with practice or experience. All learning is a deliberate choice. You have to actually choose to learn something. You have to bring your attention to it. And we'll be talking a fair bit about attention and the psychology of focus as we go throughout the rest of tonight. But many of you may have heard of the 10,000 hour rule. It was made popular by a man named Malcolm Gladwell in a book called Outliers, I think it was. The actual psychological concept was created by a psychologist named K. Anders Ericsson from, I think he's at Florida State. And the idea behind this is that it takes 10,000 hours of deliberate, focused practice to become an expert at anything. Now, if you take those 10,000 hours, it's a lot of hours, by the way, and you say, all right, I'm going to do 1,000 hours a year. Well, that's 10 years. 1,000 hours a year means 3 hours a day for 10 years. That's what it takes to become an expert at anything. I definitely did not practice that much as an undergraduate. But so what we need to do with our students is help them figure out ways to consistently learn their skills, because the only way we can learn from a motor perspective is with practice or experience. And the last aspect of this is that motor learning leads to relatively permanent changes in skilled behavior. There's the phrase that's thrown around, practice makes perfect. I think its more insidious cousin is perfect practice makes perfect. My problem with that is that it sets up the expectation of perfection. And I don't know that we can ever be perfect. I think we should always strive for excellence, but perfection, I don't know that that's actually attainable. Anyway, I don't know that practice makes perfect, but it definitely makes permanent. Whatever we do in the practice room is going to happen on stage. Whatever your students do in the choral rehearsal will happen on stage. My movement mentor said, as we rehearse, so we perform. And if we are conscious and if we are focused and deliberate about the things that we do and we actually practice what we're hoping to do on stage, we have a really good chance that that's going to happen. If we slack, or if we let things slide, or if we are unfocused in our practice, we will do that on stage. And I have seen that time and time and time again in my students' work. And they say, well, why didn't I go very well? And I say, well, how'd your practice go? And generally, they just kind of shrug and move on with their lives. So this is motor learning. And I think one of the things that we need to do, and kind of the thesis of this entire talk that we're having tonight, is that as choir directors, I think that we can help our students develop good vocal technique by helping them figure out how to practice. And the warm up is one of the best ways to do that, because you can begin to develop a lexicon, a vocabulary of technical skills, and you can teach them those technical skills. And then when you're working on a piece of repertoire, you can say, remember when we did this in the warm up? I need you to apply that here. And it creates a direct link between a technical function and then a performance sound that you're looking for. It also, if we organize it correctly, puts them, the student, in charge of their own learning. They become independent, autonomous musicians. And again, I think that that's the goal. We want them to be in charge. In a second, I'm going to give a bit of an anecdote about what we've been doing at Westminster and some of our choir, our singers' responses. But the main thing of that anecdote is our singers are saying that even though we're entirely remote, they're actually finding they're becoming better musicians because they can't coast. They're alone in a room on Zoom. They have to bring it. They have to do it on their own. And so that's just been an interesting side effect to going entirely remote. Any questions here before we move on to talk about some of the specifics of this? All right. Well, then we'll just keep on rolling. So some elements of effective practice. The first thing, and this is kind of obvious, is we need to determine what we want to teach, and more importantly, why we need to teach it. I was recently invited to come in and lecture for one of our graduate choral conducting classes, and so as a sea of choral conductors, and I very frequently have private students, private choral conducting students that want to study voice from me, and some of them are really good. They could almost be, soloists if they wanted to. They would rather flap their arms than be flapped at. And I'll often ask them, what kind of things do you do with your choirs? And they'll say, oh, well, I'll use lip trills, or I do ming, 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 or I do this, or I do that. And I go, that's a fantastic exercise. Why do you do it? And then they look at me blankly. And they have no idea why they're doing the exercise. And as a voice teacher, I think that's kind of interesting. It just seems to me that the reason they're doing them is because they read it in a book, they saw it in a clinic, or it's the thing that their choir director always did to fix problems. And so they're throwing vocal exercises at a choir, or metaphors or images or corrective cues, without actually understanding what the exercise is trying to fix. And so I think it's important that when we go into a rehearsal, when I go into a lesson, this is the same approach that I bring into my lessons, that I'm actually listening to the sound that's coming out of my choir's mouth. And then once I listen to that sound, that's the symptom. I think of this kind of like a doctor. And this is the way I teach in my voice science class. When you go to see a doctor, the first thing they say, what are your symptoms? And you say, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. They take those ideas as symptoms and they think back to what they've been taught in med school about the way the body functions, about physiology and how the different pieces relate to each other. And they take these symptoms and they plug them into that knowledge of function and they go, okay, well, this thing controls this, this, and this. It's probably a problem with this. And then they go, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. So the prescriptive cue comes at the end of the process. It's not like you walk into the doctor's office and they hand you amoxicillin and send you on your way. And so I encourage my students to go through the same kind of process. As choir directors, especially when you're dealing with a young population, most of the population is probably not taking private lessons unless you go to one of those high schools. That was not my experience. Very few of us took private lessons. The only reason I took private lessons was because a friend of my parents paid for it for us because we couldn't afford it. It's important, I think, to have a basic idea of what precedes things. What is the most foundational technical concepts? And we can talk about that a little bit more. The other thing I think it's important to do is to look at the repertoire that you're about to sing with your choir and determine what the technical challenges are going to be of that repertoire, and then address those in the warm up. The idea here is that in the warm up, you build the technical skills. If we're to use the metaphor, you give them all a little paint thing and help them mix the paints so that when you get into rehearsing, they actually have the skills and the tools that they need in order to do the thing. So once we've figured out exactly what we want to teach and we figured out why we want to teach it, we need to remember that for beginning students, we need to isolate skills. And I think this is true for the warm up. Um, there's a lot that goes on to make the singing voice work. Again, I'm a voice scientist, and if I go too far in the science direction, someone please just unmute and say hold up, and bring me back in. We have to get the body to align, right? We've got to get air into the body. When the air comes into the body, if you didn't know this, put your fingers on your larynx and take a deep breath in. What happens to the position of your larynx? Generally drops down. So the way we get air into the body influences the position of the larynx. The position of the larynx influences the way the vocal folds come together. And then when that sound is created, it goes into the resonators, and then the tongue and the jaw and the lips and the back of the throat all influence that sound. And it's a very messy system in that it's non-linear, meaning that sound waves don't just go out, but they also go back down, and they make the vocal folds change the way they vibrate. So it's a very complicated system that we do. And many of my beginning students, they easily get overwhelmed with all of the things that they have to do. And I have to tell them it is okay just to focus on one thing at a time. And here that concept of focus kind of pops up. Focus is one of the most important things that I work on with my students is where do you put your attention? Psychologists and that study attention, they kind of disagree on the specific limits of our attention, but they do all agree that it is finite. There's simply only so much that your brain can focus on at any given time. And where we put that specific focus is incredibly important, not just to our ability to become better musicians, but a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who came up with a concept called he was the father of positive psychology. He thinks that attention is the key to optimal living. That's his big thesis there. Um, Regardless, we have a limited amount of cognitive power, and though we think we're good at multitasking, we're actually really not good at it as a species. And so when working with young students, if we've figured out what we want to teach, we need to direct our students to focus on one thing at a time to give the brain the information it needs to entrench that new process. Um, we can work on multiple skills, but we can't do it all at the same time. We need to focus on this one and then move to this one and then move to this one with beginning students. After they begin to develop those skills, then we can start to teach relationships among those skills. But in the beginning, we need to focus on one particular skill at a time. I mentioned the focus was important, correct? A lot of the motor learning literature talks about how when we are focusing on skills, we need to focus on the results of a particular skill, not on the behavior or the skill itself. The primary leader of this is a woman named Gabrielle Wolf. She was trained in Germany and now teaches in Nevada, I think, but she's one of the leading authorities on motor learning. And she has a concept called the constrained action hypothesis. And the idea here is that when we learn something, um, it's a complex behavior, and it's called a controlled process when we first learn a new thing. And what that means is that we need to control all of the elements of it because it's hard for us. It takes an immense amount of cognitive load and tension to learn any new particular thing. But once you've done it, and once you've practiced it, and once you've had a bunch of successful attempts at it, it gets easier and the cognitive load reduces. And so this becomes an automated or a habituated process. This is what we're looking for, right? We want these automated processes. I don't want my students to go out on stage and then have to think about all this stuff that they have to do. I want them to focus on maybe like making music and not, am I breathing correctly? So the goal is to automate all these processes. However, if we start to focus on the mechanism itself, right? If as a singer, I'm thinking about the movement of my lips, or I'm thinking that I've got to move my soft palate back, or are my ribs expanding? That kind of internal focus of attention inhibits automated processes. And Gabrielle Wolf has a huge body of literature that supports this in pretty much all domains. She likes to work with golf because it's easy to assess. But she has several studies on singers and several studies on pianists as well. And both singers and pianists, expert judges judge them as being more technically proficient and more musical when they were focusing on external objects. So instead of the singer thinking about their specific lips, they were thinking about the story they were trying to tell, or they were listening out into the hall to the kind of sound that they were making. Pianists could be thinking about internal would be the finger striking the keys, or it could be the tone of their finger that they were trying to produce on the piano. So we want to try and get our students to think about something external to themselves. This applies to a lot of other things as well. In the martial arts, stage combat, I do Taekwondo and I do Krav Maga and self-defense things. We're constantly trying to get off of ourselves and onto another person. It makes us more stable. So trying to find an external locus of attention. And this brings us to feedback. If we're trying to get our students to think about something, we're trying to focus their attention to harness all of their cognitive power. We want that to be external to them. We don't want them thinking about stuff that's going on inside. We want them to think about something outside of them. We need to give them that. And one of the best things that we can give them is specific feedback. And this is where I think everything starts to kind of come together. In an applied lesson, when I'm in a room with a student, this is my studio, when I have a singer in here, I can give them feedback, right? I can listen to the sound, I can process it, and I can say, do this. That's me giving them feedback. Doesn't work that well in Zoom lessons, by the way, because even if I can hear my student, it's a degraded audio quality. I don't get all of the sound. I have a student right now whose internet connection is so poor that out of a 30-minute lesson, I give 2 30-minute lessons a week, I maybe actually hear 15 minutes. I literally only hear 50% of her lesson because her internet quality is so bad. You're a choir director. Everyone's on mute. You're not getting anything. So we need to help our students figure out where to apply their focus. And I argue that perceptual feedback is the best thing. So back to the literature. We want feedback that can be perceived, right? And the way we perceive things is with our 5 senses. My teacher in grad school called it sensual singing. And by that, he didn't necessarily mean intimate singing. He meant that engages all of the 5 senses. As a performer, I want my audience not just to see me, not just to hear me, but they need to feel something inside of them, right? They need to almost be able to taste the language and smell the language. And so if we can engage the 5 senses in our students, we're going to promote a bit better learning in them. Now, taste and smell are hard, right? I can maybe get a little metaphorical, and I do feel almost that there's a different taste in my mouth to German than French. They have a different flavor to them, for lack of a better word. And we can use smell to trigger emotion and memory. They're very, very intimately related. So when working with a student to be expressive, sometimes I can talk about, all right, so you're talking about being in the forest. Great. What does a forest smell like? And then that can help evoke a particular image. But when we're teaching technique, we're pretty much limited to hearing, to sight, and to feel. And I'm going to give you some very specific things about that in just a second. But the main thing is that the more senses we engage, the better the learning is going to be. And this is where I think we can really help our students, particularly in remote environments, is that we can give them specific senses to engage that are going to set up a learning for their learning, technical learning. So to kind of review before we launch into the practical application of all this stuff, we need to determine what it is that we want to teach. We need to determine why that we need to teach it. When we begin to teach all these things, we need to try and do so in isolation. We need to do one at a time, hopefully in some kind of systematic order, which I'm happy to talk about in a second. We need to help our students focus on the results, and that result should be some kind of perceptual feedback that they can feel, that they can see, or that they can hear. If you can figure out how to engage a bunch of high school students on Zoom in smell and taste, by all means, email me. I would love to know. What are your questions about all of that psychology stuff? Okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this is excellent. I wish that more people would talk about this because for our young students, this is another way to sort of get them to understand and to learn the process. And I think sometimes for young voice students, they're so wrapped up in you have to breathe this way and stand this way and your sound comes here that this is really, really wonderful. Thank you so much. So it's great. So
well, thank you. It's been rather revolutionary in the way I approach my teaching. I like it because it removes me from the process. It's not uncommon for my students when they get to their senior recital for me to have only heard 70% of the repertoire until the dress rehearsal. And because I'll say, how's this song coming? Oh, I got that. Great. That's perfect, right? Because I've done the best that I can to give them the skills that they need to learn it on their own. And you're exactly right. It's so easy to get in your head with all of this stuff. I was way there, right? And it's maddening. The body functions best when you just kind of leave it alone, assuming you've laid the groundwork for that. So thank you. I'm glad to hear that this is useful. What other questions do you all have, at least about the psychology, before we start to get the practical application? All right, well, let's just kind of dive in. First, I'm going to give you I don't have this on a slide, but since we have the time, I'll talk about it a little bit. When I teach, I have a flow chart in my head. As I mentioned, the first thing is to determine what to teach. And I use this flow chart to organize myself because sometimes when I'm listening to a student, it's like, oh my God, where do I start? It's either so good that like, I don't know what to say, or it's so bad that I don't know what to say, right? Like where do you, there's so much to fix, where do you begin? Similarly, when my students get into the practice room, if I want them to self-assess and I want them to diagnose and be self-sufficient students, they need to have a process for fixing things when they don't know what to do. So when I'm working with students, my flow chart basically starts with alignment. How do we stack the body? All right. There, as I say to my students, if the lamp is broken, it doesn't really matter if you plug it into the wall, it ain't going to work. And so we need to make certain that the body is aligned. And oftentimes when students are in lessons, they'll say, this passage just feels weird. Right, great. How's your alignment? They put themselves in alignment. Boom, everything works better. So that's the first step. For me, the second step is inhalation. And this one we are going to talk a little bit more about. I do think it's important that I tell my students what is happening, the declarative aspects, the know that portions, partly because we are out of the dark ages in voice science. We have MRIs, we have stroboscopy, we can look at the vocal folds. My students can just look up whatever they want to on YouTube or Wikipedia. Some of it's correct, some of it's really not correct. And so I think it's important that they have at least a basic understanding of what the anatomy is and where it is. For instance, in high school choir camps, I teach a high school choir camp at Westminster every summer. And I'll oftentimes say, where is your diaphragm? Because most choir students know that we breathe from our diaphragm. And I'll stand up so you can see me a little bit. They'll say, my diaphragm's here. No, that is your stomach. You have your stomach and your intestines, reproductive organs, all of that is down in the lower part of your abdomen. That's where they should be. If your lungs are down there, then you should probably see a doctor because that's not where they're supposed to be. The lungs actually sit very, very high up in the chest, and the diaphragm connects to the front of the sternum and wraps all the way around the rib cage. I think it's important that they know that that's actually where it is. And its action is that it descends down, and when it descends down, it displaces the abdominal viscera, which is those organs I just mentioned, and they push down on your stomach, and that's why we feel the low breath. We also have muscles that pull the rib cage out. And so I think it's important when I first start to introduce inhalation to a student I ask them, what do you know about breathing? And then I clarify some of the anatomy. I'll show them a picture if I think it's necessary. And then I do an exploratory inhalation thing. My opinion is that we are all different people and we are all going to breathe differently. I'm a 5'11" baritone. That's very different than my 5'2" coloratura soprano. We're going to feel it differently. We're just different people. And so the exercise that I do, and you all are quite welcome to play along, is I ask them to take their thumbs in any space between your pelvis and your rib cage, all the way around is fair game. And so I'll ask them to take their thumbs, and again, I'll stand up so you can kind of sort of see me. And I'll say, place it somewhere. Great, right there. Let's take a slow, quiet breath. And I think this is important. It should be a slow and a quiet breath. We'll talk about that in just a second. And so when you inhale, can you allow the space right where your thumbs are to expand? And we get perfect. Now move your thumbs. And they'll go, here, great. Can we breathe here? Perfect. What about your back? And I'll have them put their fingers in their back. Can you allow that space to expand? And they'll oftentimes say, yes, but that's really hard. Yup, it's hard to get the thumbs to expand in the back. You have levels. You can have one thumb up, one thumb down. Can you breathe in both of those places? Right? And so I'll have them do that 6, 7 times, moving all the way around their body. And the reason for this is we don't typically think about our breathing throughout the day. It's an unconscious process. Can you imagine having to think about your breath every time you breathe in? It would be, you would have no room for anything else. But I want them to develop conscious control over a system that's supposed to function unconsciously. And that's this entire mechanism, by the way. We want to develop unconscious or conscious control over a mechanism that's designed by nature to function unconsciously. It brings awareness to what's happening in their body, which is something that everybody in middle school and high school probably needs. Most of my college students need that. And it begins to give them a sense of where in their body they can take air. And then I'll say, where did you feel it the easiest? Where was it easiest to get your breath in? And they'll usually say somewhere around the front or possibly the front and the sides. And I'll say, great, put your thumbs there, let's go. And that's how I approach inhalation. As they've been with me for a while, perhaps I need to kind of poke them in a particular direction. I kind of like the breath to be a combination of right beneath the rib cage on the sides and the front. And so I typically focus them on that space between their hips and ribs. But in the beginning, I just let them explore their own breath. And so when I'm doing an opening warm up with them, I just play a 5-note scale, whatever it is, on ya, ya, yo, yo, whatever it is. And I'll say, all right, what's your alignment doing? Just check in with your alignment. And then they check in with their own alignment. And then I say, put your thumb somewhere on your body. Just feel for how that breath is. Pay attention to how the breath is entering your body. And it just gets them to notice what their body is doing. And I have found, and there's substantive research, there's a woman named Kathleen Verdellini, by the way, who's one of the first people that's applied motor learning to music. She's a musician that then got a doctorate in psychology and communication, in motor learning in particular. And her first rule of all of this is just to get them to explore their body. And just by getting them to tap into their own self, oftentimes the body brings itself into alignment and balance. And that's the goal, right? If I can fix something without ever bringing it up, that's a win for everybody involved. So this is how I teach inhalation. Oh, not quite there yet. So alignment, step 1. Step 2, inhalation. How does air get into the body? Step 3 is about positioning. And for me, positioning, the Italians called it gola aperta, which means open throat, which is how we achieve this open space. People talk about that in different ways. The beginning of a yawn. I'm currently using the term the stifled yawn. It's like, you know, if you had your video on now and I was boring you and you were going to yawn, you would try and stifle it so you didn't make me mad. That kind of sensation. Some people say it's like you have a hot potato in the back of your throat. That, to me, that relates directly to inhalation. The way we get air into the body should influence more than just getting air into the body. So we need to help our students create a link between us. So it's alignment, inhalation, positioning or open throat, and then exhalation, how we get air out of the body. When working with my students, the first thing I tell them to do when you're in the practice room, check your alignment, make sure your breath is coming in well, have you positioned well. If all that's working, make certain, as I say, that the vocal hose is on. I use a lot of hose and water metaphors just because. It's kind of like if you have a hose and you're trying to water your roses, but you haven't turned the spigot on, you're not going to do a very good job of watering. So we need to make sure that the air is actually flowing first. Easiest way to do that is with a lip trill. Couple thoughts about lip trills. Any exercise or cue that you give to anybody for anything is going to have benefits, and it's also going to have problems. Lip trills are fantastic at helping students regulate airflow, if they can do them, right? Not everybody can do a lip trill, and that doesn't mean you're a bad singer, it just means you can't do a lip trill. The other thing is that for whatever reason, lip trills tend to make the back of the throat want to collapse. I have theories on why, that it has to do with fluid dynamics and physics, and so let's not go into that. But when you're working with your students on lip trills, which is a wonderful thing to do, I make all of my students start. Okay, for some reason, my Zoom thing. I'm still here, right? Y'all can still see me? Yes, okay, great. For some reason, my Zoom said you've been logged out for inactivity. That's strange. Anyway, so I use lip trills all the time, but we just need to remember that it makes the back of the throat want to collapse. So a reminder that we're looking to focus our students' attention on specific procedural or sensory feedback. So we're looking for feel, we're looking for listen, we're looking for see. A lip trill. Nice, simple 5-note scale. What can they feel on that? Remember that the goal of the lip trill, at least in this particular moment, is to make certain that the air is flowing, that we actually have air moving out of the body. So let's first address what happens if they can't do a lip trill, because not everybody can. Sometimes I find that they just take their fingers and put them right next to their mouth. It sometimes will take the weight of the cheeks out of the equation. And oftentimes can help them get the lip trill. The reason a lip trill won't work is because there's tension in the lips or in the jaw, or there's not enough air flowing. Those are usually the two things. If that's not working, they can certainly do tongue trills. People can't do that. Raspberries, also useful. Not everyone can do those either. An open straw, very useful. Same thing with a very, very light V. All of those do basically the same thing as a lip trill. And so if you have students who are like, I can't do it, rather than making them fail at the attempt, give them something else to do. So how can we assure that the air is flowing? One of the easiest ways is to have your students put their hand in front of their mouth, do the lip trill, and just focus on the air hitting their hand. This is an external locus of attention. We're focused on something outside of the body, and we're feeling it with our hands. And so we're getting that kinesthetic sense of the air continually moving and hitting our hands. We can also, I don't have any nearby, but you can get tissue paper, right? Kleenex or something, and dangle it in front of your face. And you can see the air actually move the tissue paper. And that gets sight involved, and they can see that it's moving. And if the tissue goes like this, and then like this, and then like this, it's probably not a consistently flowing airstream. We want it to just flutter in the wind, not kind of surge in the wind. We can have them feel for the tingle on the lips. Whenever you do, you can feel that little tingle, right? That brings it a little bit more extrinsically from the body. Not quite as much as feeling it on the hand, but it still gives them some kind of sensory input, sensory feedback to focus on. Listen. They can listen to the turbulence of the air going through the lip trill. And oftentimes I'll have my students listen for that and say, can you make that constant? We're looking for a consistently flowing airstream. If the vocal folds ever get any kind of surge in air, they only have one option, and that's to grip. They're designed by nature to grip to keep you from dying. That's the swallowing reflex. If you ever swallowed something down the wrong pipe, you know this. It grips really, really well. So we need to help our students figure out how to have a smooth, consistent airflow. Listening and feeling for the air is a great way to do that. Other ways, other things. I mentioned that the lip trill likes the back of the throat to collapse. It just kind of makes that happen. So I'll ask my students to listen to the vowel that's behind the lip trill. For instance, there's this vowel. it's a successful lip trill, but what vowel was behind that? Which is probably not the sound we want them to make. What we're looking for is which is and so I can have them, even if they're muted or in the practice room, listen for the consistency of that vowel. And oftentimes I'll have them practice going back and forth. Do the tight one first. Now do the other one. This is called negative practice. And what it means, and oftentimes physical therapists will use it. If you have a muscle that's chronically tight and they can't learn to release it, what they'll do is say, all right, if it's chronically tight, make it tighter. And then you get them to really squeeze it. And then they feel that they have conscious control over that muscle, and then they can learn to release it. It's the same thing with this vowel space. What I'm essentially looking for is that the back of the throat opens and the larynx descends a little bit. But I don't tell them that because they don't need to focus on the mechanism. They need to focus on the result. And the result is an open sound. The function is that the larynx has dropped. When I'm continuing to work on lip trills, as you ascend in pitch, and you can hear that the quality of that vowel changes. We go from again, that's what the body is designed to do. The larynx is designed to elevate as we ascend in pitch. It puts us into a yell posture, which was great when we were running, from lions that were trying to chase us in the Serengeti. It's not so great for singing. And so by having them listen to the quality of the vowel behind the lip trill, I've found students are typically more able to keep the back of the throat open. What are your questions about this so far? Okay, well then I'll just keep chugging along. So alignment, make sure that the body's stacked. Make sure that they've figured out at least a generic way to get the breath in that's not causing them to heave at the shoulders. We generally want lower sensations in breath. Make sure that we have some semblance of an open throat, however you want to go about doing that. And then we want to make sure that the air is going to flow using a lip trill, using a very light V, tongue trills, raspberries, and open straw, all wonderful ways to go about doing this. Then there's this term called support. Support is a term that gets thrown around kind of a lot. The typical, at least maybe it's different for choirs, it's not really my expertise, but in applied voice and operatic singing is if there's a problem with the voice, well, you probably need to support more, which typically means people start to push. And that's not necessarily what we're looking for with support. Support actually is a balance of breath as it relates to the production of tone. So we need to find a balance of the flow of air to the resistance of that air at the vocal fold level. One of the best ways to teach support, I think, is with straws. I love straws. One of my students bought me this. It's a little wooden box, and inside are a little wooden cylinder, and inside are 3 little bitty metal straws. They're about 4 millimeters in diameter each, and it's even got a little cleaner thing. I love these, and I'm encouraging my students to buy them because they're great. So straw phonation. There's a man named Ingo Tita. He's one of the preeminent voice scientists in the field right now. He's written a ton. He has 3 degrees in physics, by the way, and he's written a lot about the physics of what straws do to the voice. And the conclusion is they're awesome for the voice. I like to use small diameter straws. So coffee stirrers are brilliant for this if you don't have the little metal tube. If all you have are the soda straws, that's fine. Pinch the end. All right, I don't have one nearby. I'm teaching at home. I'm just up in my office doing this lecture. But you can have the students pinch the end. And I tell them on a scale of 1 to 10, you want like a 7. You want a really good pinch at the end. This is going to make them have to work a lot. There's a lot of resistance at the end of the straw. If they don't have straws, you can use a V, albeit a slightly tighter V than you were using to work on breath flow. So instead of, we want And if we don't want to use a V, you can always use a TH. I love my students to work on TH. It's weird. And the students are going to kind of rebel against that to begin with. They're going to think it's very funny. It makes their lips kind of vibrate. But TH can be very, very beneficial to students. So if I'm working on support, again, we want to draw their focus to specific feedback. And the feedback that I use specifically with straw, you can put your hand at the end and you can feel the air hit your hand, right? You can put a tissue again. You can see the tissue kind of flutter. If you have a straw nearby and you would like to play along, or you can use a V or TH, that's fine. As you begin to sing it, you'll notice that there's a lot of pressure, right? You kind of have to like lean into your sound. And I use the word lean a lot. Some of you may have heard the term appoggio. It comes from the Italian term appoggiarsi a, which means to lean upon. And it is the way in the Italian school they talked about breath support, was that they were leaning into their sound. And I think that the small diameter straw is a great way to teach students how to do that. And so I'll have my students feel for the air on their hands. If they're doing a V or a TH, I'll have them feel for the buzzy vibratory sensations on their lips. I'll have them look and see the flutter of a tissue paper or a piece of paper as they blow through, or have them feel for that sense of lean. Now, a bit about pressure. Pressure is just fine. Tension is a problem, but pressure is fine. If we've aligned, if we've positioned, then pressure should be just fine. Other things I'll have them is listen. Again, listen to the quality of the vowel. There's a difference between and right? We're looking for that more deep kind of sound in most singing. I'll have them listen for the smoothness of the scale. Is very articulate, but it's micro pulsations and airflow, and the vocal folds tend to grip because of that. So how smooth can you make your scale? And then there's a quality I call settling. And if you've sung, if you're a singer, you've probably felt that sometimes when the voices work, it's like the voice will kind of fight itself, and then all of a sudden it just releases and everything seems much easier. When you're using a V or a TH or a straw in particular, you're going to feel that. The vibrato is a little wonky. It's either a little fast or a little jagged and uneven. And then all of a sudden it just kind of melts and settles. And so I ask my students to listen for the voice always settling. It finally got there at the end. And most of the time, it's going to take a little bit of time for it to settle. That's generally an indication that the student is beginning to achieve support. And so I'll have them do that on vocal exercises. I love making them do that on onsets. I'll have them do that on their repertoire. In fact, I spend a 30-minute lesson with my student basically going back and forth between the straw and the vowels from his piece today in a lesson, helping him learn to carry that feeling of support from the straw into the vowels. And so you can do that in the repertoire as well. You can introduce the concept in the warm-up, and then when you get to the actual repertoire, all right, everyone get your straws out. We're going to learn pitches and rhythms singing on the straw. The reason I like straws, implicitly, straws take care of a lot of vocal problems without you ever having to address it. It balances pressure on either side of the vocal folds and allows the vocal folds to find a slightly lower position and a slightly more released position while still staying thickly engaged. These are all good things. And the cool thing is, you don't have to tell your students that's what's happening. All you have to do is listen to the quality of the vowel behind that. Let's sing, right? Feel for the air on your hands as you learn these pitches in your piece. But the exercise itself is taking care of a lot of the issues. And this helps to develop vocal technique without the student ever being aware. Kathleen Bertolini talks about students need to attend to a task. They need to focus on a particular thing, which are all these feedbacks that we've just covered. But they don't need to be aware of what's happening. In fact, some literature suggests that if they are aware of what's happening, it actually impedes the learning process. And so that's why I think that focus is so important. With whatever kind of technique we're trying to give, we need to make sure the students know exactly what they're supposed to focus on and what they should feel that gives them a barometer to know whether or not they're hitting the target. Whether or not they understand why they're feeling that, wait till they get to college and take my voice science class, and then we can talk about all of that. But in the moment, they don't necessarily need to be aware of what's happening. They just need to attend to the particular task. So those are some practical applications of this to the choral ensemble, and we are quickly running out of time. So I would be happy to answer any questions you have. Where's my Zoom thing? There's my Zoom thing. Oh no, where's it going? No, I don't want to leave the meeting. Sorry. Stop share. There we go. What are your questions? What do you think about visualizations and motions that appear to take the student's focus off their vocal instrument? I think movement is fantastic, right? One of my colleagues, Jason Vodica, Westminster gave a webinar on Sunday. And in that webinar, we were talking about what we are doing at Westminster to have choral ensembles, because the state of New Jersey has dictated that we can have no performing arts classes meet in person. And so how does a choir college, that's literally our middle name is choir, how do we do anything? And several of us have tried to put some stuff together, and it's incorporating this kind of thing with audiation and learning theory. And my colleague, Jason Vodica, was talking about Laban and using Laban movement techniques. And so asking a choir, okay, choir, let's look at this phrase. Is this phrase jab? Or does this phrase glide? Or does this phrase flick? And they'll go, oh, this is a gliding phrase. Perfect. Take 5 seconds, and I want you, each person, come up with your own gliding gesture. And so maybe it's in te domine, right? Maybe that's something. And somebody else will do something totally different. And that begins to get the body to move and to kind of internalize the overall gesture. So I think motion's fantastic. Visualizations, you have to be a little bit careful with. And the only reason I say that is because there actually is a substantive body of literature that indicates that metaphor and imagery in particular aren't as helpful as we think they are. Kathleen Verdolini, again, I mentioned her because she's a pretty big name in the field. I can't remember how many studies, but she's had over 800 participants in multiple studies over the past decade and has yet to find any evidence that imagery and metaphor are effective at training voices, which is completely disheartening because like half my pedagogy is based off of imagery and metaphors, right? I think where the rubber kind of meets the road there is that when we give a student an image or a metaphor, it needs to be something they can relate to. The pedagogue Richard Miller talked about this all the time. And he would say like, saying that breathing is like jumping out of an airplane is meaningless unless you've jumped out of an airplane. And so I think we need to make certain that whatever images or visualizations that we mean are something that the students can relate to, something that they have experienced, or that we can tie, and I think this is the big thing, that we can tie a kinesthetic sensation to. They need to be able to feel something, because remember, the only way that we take in information is via sensation. And so we need to give them some kind of, I think feel is like one of the most important things that we can do. And so if we can attach some sort of kinesthetic sensation to a visualization, an image or metaphor, then I think then it's perfectly good. But you just have to be a little bit careful about making sure that the students can relate to it and have some experience with it. What other questions do you have? So I just threw a lot of links into the chat window. Sorry about that. I have 7 or 8 videos that I just made last week of virtual voice lessons kind of ideas. It's the stuff that we talked about tonight, but I talk about positioning. I talk about alignment. I talk about resonance. What else do I talk about? I can't remember. I talk about 7 or 8 different things in there. So if this was useful to you and you want to know my thoughts on resonance, I have thoughts on resonance, on alignment and things like that, by all means, check those videos out. They're free because it's YouTube. But they are linked to a book that I wrote with my colleague Jim Jordan and my colleague Kathy Price called Anatomy of Tone. And in that book, I mentioned that I've been working with Jim a lot on the synthesis and the meeting together of vocal pedagogy and choral pedagogy. And that book is the product of that. I have chapters on respiration, I have chapters on warming up, and I have chapters on resonance. And then Jim talks about how that applies to the work that he does with Williams and Voices here at Westminster. We also at Westminster have a series of webinars that are coming up. I'll be giving this lecture again, but other topics in this webinar, let me see what I got. I know one of my colleagues is doing stuff with working with transgender voices. We're doing care of the professional voice. Some of my music education colleagues are talking about how to do virtual improvisation with your choirs. So how do you help your choirs improvise via Zoom? That's Jason Vodica. How to incorporate STEM, because I know that we're all trying to meet those state requirements. How do we get STEM put into our virtual kind of classrooms? And then if any of you know people who are trying to figure out how to wrap their heads around teaching music theory virtually, one of my theory colleagues is going to be giving a lecture on how he's done virtual theory this semester. Musicianship in particular, kind of hard to do on Zoom. So those links there. What are the questions? Well, great. Oh wait, yeah, literally 6th grade choirs, and some of them can't seem to get it. It always surprised. I was a trumpet player in high school, so like getting my lips to flutter has never been an issue. But many of my students have problems with lip trills, and I make them try it a couple of times, and if they can't, I just move on. We call them the Jetsons car. Yeah. There's lots of, the idea behind the lip trill is why give the lip trill to begin with? And if my idea is that lip trills are great for establishing airflow, and I've got about 1,000 ways I can skin that cat. And so if the lip trill is not doing it, then just move on to something else. It's the function that's important, not the exercise. No one makes it to the Met because they can do lip trills, right? They make it to the Met because the lip trills have taught them a particular function that have served them in something else. So yeah, I think straws are brilliant. Oh, another thing, if they have straws and they bring a water bottle, they can blow bubbles, right? You can have them stick the straw in the bubbles, and the farther down the straw goes, the harder it is. They're all going to get wet, which is great. You have to be careful though, because if you blow too hard, you really get wet. And so you want to make certain that you find just the right amount of air pressure to get the bubbles to go without getting yourself drenched. And that of course is the function that we're trying to teach, right? Can you control and find a balance in breath flow? So bubbles are a great way. It's always a hit with the high school students that I work with. I imagine middle school too. Great. Well, if you have any other questions, by all means do reach out. I'm happy to have conversations with you, to email conversations, however I can be useful.
Thanks so much, Sean. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right. Everyone have a great night, and yeah, have a great rest of your week too. Stay safe.
Happy Thanksgiving. It's coming.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye, everybody.
Everyone, bye.